Good evening, and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library's online series of signature events. I'm Katie Stover, the Director of Reader Services, and our guest tonight is Dr. Inger Burnett-Zeigler, talking about her book, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, The Emotional Lives of Black Women. Inger writes her book to and for Black women, but don't think there isn't something useful in here for everyone, as you will learn during our conversation. Please consider purchasing a copy at bookshop.org. Bookshop.org supports independent bookstores with every purchase. This is Dr. Burnett-Zeigler's first book, but you've probably read her writing in the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Hill, and the Chicago Tribune. Or you've seen her on CNN or WGN. She has been writing and speaking about the image of the strong and stressed Black women long before her signature piece in the Times. A licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Burnett-Zeigler is also an associate professor in the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. Fun fact, Inger is a certified yoga instructor, and we might be talking about that later on. Please welcome Dr. Inger Burnett-Zeigler.
Thank you so much, Katie, for inviting me to participate in this conversation with you today. I'm thrilled to be here.
You said that it's been a whirlwind for your first book on your press tour. I'm so glad to hear that.
Absolutely. You know, the book was 3 years in the making, and now to have it out into the world and to be hearing the response from people that it has touched and get that feedback, it's really meaningful. And I'm so delighted to be able to share it.
There's a lot of powerful material in here, and an uninformed glance might have a reader thinking that it's a typical self-help book, but it is definitely not that. So would you tell us a little about what compelled you to write your book?
Sure. So as you mentioned in your introduction, I am a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Northwestern. And in my clinical practice, I treat primarily adult women, African-American women, who are presenting with a variety of different mental health concerns, be it stress, anxiety, depression, histories of trauma, and the like. And what I learned after my years in practice and just kind of being a citizen in the world is that there's so many Black women who are struggling with deep emotional pain from family, from their personal life experiences, from just the various things that they confront on a day-to-day basis that they're not showing the world, and they don't feel that they're comfortable or have the space to be able to acknowledge or talk about these challenges. Time after time, Black women were coming into the therapy space and talking about experiences that so many others endure, but feeling alone, feeling like they're the only ones because nobody was talking about it. And so I wanted this book to really shed light on the other side of what strong Black women show the world. You know, we see our friends, we see folks in the workplace, we see folks in our neighborhoods and in our own families, and we see them in a particular way. But we're standing side by side with folks that internally may be going through a lot that we don't know anything about. And so this is an opportunity for people to know that they're not alone, for allies to, see a new way of people that they may be encountering on a day-to-day basis, and really raise the awareness around mental health concerns in Black women in general.
Inger, would you talk a little bit about the image of the strong Black woman, because it's prevalent in media and our culture, and I don't know anybody who doesn't know or credit a strong Black woman with being a positive influence on their life. But until I read your book, it didn't occur to me that there could be an emotional toll to that image as well.
Sure. You know, as a Black woman myself, the strong Black woman is really inherent to our being. It's kind of how we're raised to be, even as little girls, to be tough, to be resilient, to, not cry, to wipe away our tears and be able to continue to confront difficult circumstances, whether that be showing up for your family, showing up for your community, showing up in the workplace. And these are all strengths. These are all things that many of us are incredibly proud of. We're proud of our grit. We're proud of being able to handle it all and take on and confront and overcome. That's something that, I certainly feel good about, being able to overcome and do hard things. But the challenge comes in when strong Black women are not given the space or given the permission to acknowledge feelings of distress or feelings of discomfort. Engaging in the world, particularly in today's society, is challenging as a Black woman. Every day we're confronted with racism and discrimination. Particularly over this past year, we've been confronted with vicarious exposures to trauma. In the book, I talk in detail about the multiple forms of trauma, from childhood abuse to intimate partner violence to, significant loss that Black women experience. And all of that takes an emotional toll. But that strong Black woman prototype doesn't allow us to really attend to the emotional toll that can come with being a Black woman in society today. And so this book was an invitation to hold space for that, to really be able to acknowledge and talk about those difficult emotional experiences that can come with being a strong Black woman.
And that emotional toll you mentioned, that has a physiological toll too, doesn't it? Can you talk a little bit about that impact on Black women?
Absolutely. As a researcher, I, really study the impact of stress, chronic stress, not only on mental health, but also physical health. And we know that Black women face a disproportionate burden of stress related to many of the things that I've already mentioned, but also including finances, employment, relationships, chronic health conditions, and racism and discrimination and the like. And many, many studies have shown us that stress is also closely linked to a number of chronic health conditions that are disproportionately prevalent among African American women, like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. And it was very important to me to make that link in the book, because so often we separate mental health from physical health. But we know that these two are so tightly connected, and by better managing our stress, by better managing our mental health, we're also taking better care of ourselves holistically. And there are lots of different studies, and I actually lead a study now that's looking at the impact of mindfulness for stress management and how that can not only improve mental health, but also improve physical health. And so absolutely, that the two, stress is closely linked with physical health, and by treating stress, we can also improve physical health.
In the past year, one of the things that seems to have come to the forefront of media and cultural attention is the impact from the pandemic had on mental health. It appears that people seem to be more comfortable talking about mental health issues and their causes for panic, anxiety, or their fear. But I get a sense from your book that it's not easy at all for Black women to admit those needs. So what are your thoughts on that, and why? How would we overcome that?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts about that. Of course, the pandemic, the last 18 months has been incredibly stressful for everyone worldwide. People have feared for their personal safety. People have feared for the safety of their loved ones. People have experienced significant loss through death through people who have acquired the virus, as well as, perhaps job disruption, finances, housing, all of the things that have been very, very stressful over this last year. I think it is important to highlight, however, that the pandemic stress was a stress that was added on to a disproportionate amount of stress that Black women were already experiencing. So even prior to the pandemic, Black women carried more stress. And this is, many studies have shown this, namely the American Psychological Association puts out annual reports on how individuals rate their personal stress. And then you add on the pandemic stress onto that for Black women. And it's really a great burden. I do think there, if we look closely, there's a light of hopefulness, particularly around how we think about the opening that the pandemic has presented for mental health, because since essentially everyone was stressed out, talking about stress, talking about mental health no longer became an other people thing, because everybody could relate to that to some extent. And I do believe that that is a good thing, because it reduced the stigma around, and I'm speaking anecdotally, of course, but I do believe that it reduced the stigma associated with talking about stress, talking about anxiety, talking about loneliness and depression, because everybody could kind of understand that a little bit in the context of the pandemic. And then further, for the first time, a lot of providers were able to provide mental health services virtually. I've been providing virtual therapy for the last 18 months, and that was something that I was unable to do in my practice previously. Insurance rules changed to accommodate for the pandemic. And as someone that studies access and engagement in mental health treatment, that's a huge win, because it reduces a lot of barriers, the time, the transportation, the childcare that might get in the way of people being able to go to a therapy session. The virtual format really made therapy more accessible for a lot of folks. So while the pandemic certainly created a lot of stress, I do think that it opened some opportunity for how we talk about mental health and how we provide mental health services that are more accessible.
I feel like I'm running into people that feel far more comfortable talking about their anxieties and their stress and their panic that the pandemic and the other incidents that have arisen in the last year. It's been a tumultuous year for many people.
Sure. So, everybody was impacted in some way. And yes. I think that global experience allows more empathy for people that may have these challenges even outside of the pandemic, to know what it feels like to be anxious or depressed or not be able to get to your loved ones, and be afraid for what the future might look like.
So do you think it's gotten a little easier for everyone to talk about their stress and have access to support and good health care to help combat that?
Yeah, I do think that we're in a pivotal moment around how the world is thinking about mental health. I think in general, I'm hearing many more conversations about mental health, prioritizing mental health. I think celebrities play an incredibly important role in terms of normalizing mental health concerns. When we see people like, Michelle Obama and Naomi Osaka and Meghan Markle, people that are very revered and beautiful, and it really gives permission to the everyday woman to also acknowledge the suffering that they may be experiencing. I will say, however, while the virtual format improved accessibility to a certain extent, there also has been a drastic increase in demand and not enough providers to meet that demand. And to extend from that, especially not enough providers of color. And so while there may be more Black folks, Black women who are considering engaging in treatment, many of them express a specific interest in having a Black woman provider, and they're simply not enough. But one of the statistics that I mentioned in the book is there are less than 5% Black clinical psychologists nationwide. And so certainly not enough for everyone to have a race match provider. And unfortunately, that can be a significant barrier when people are thinking about accessing treatment.
I'm so glad you brought that up in your book. And that was something that I hadn't thought about, that, oh my goodness, there might not be enough providers for folks seeking help. Who are the strong Black women who influenced you in your formative years? And were there times that their strength wasn't serving them as well as it should have?
Yeah, I talk about this a good bit in the book. I talk about my grandmother, a lot as my first example of a strong Black woman. She is someone who I, really looked up to as a little girl. And even after her passing and kind of getting to know a little bit more about her life and the multiple challenges that she overcame, I looked up to her kind of even more, a single mother that had moved from Montgomery, Alabama to Chicago, living in, public housing in Chicago, leaving an abusive relationship from her then husband, suffered multiple miscarriages, trauma in adulthood, and someone who kind of continued to claw themselves out of difficult circumstances, moved out of public housing and earned her home and had a successful career and was able to provide not only immense support to my mom, but also to me. And in many ways, I see her as kind of the typical strong Black woman. There are many examples of the grandma in the book. And in fact, from a friend of mine she texted me the other day and said, did everybody have the same grandma? Like, I feel like this grandma that keeps coming up in the book is such kind of this universal, grandmother that so many of us know in our families. So she certainly, and my mother as well, were certainly my key examples of strong Black women, influential examples.
Were there ever times that you saw their strength maybe failing them or not serving them and not serving them as well as it could have in certain situations when maybe strength was not the right, maybe the strong Black woman persona was not the one to adopt for a situation?
Yeah, I don't know that I understood it in that way growing up. Now my mom is fortunate enough to have a psychologist daughter who can reflect back on the ways that strength may have been harmful. Opportunities where maybe help could have been asked for when it wasn't asked for, or hurt could have been named, or boundaries could have been set. Many of those things, asking for help, saying when something is harmful, setting boundaries so that you're taking care of yourself, which may mean not doing something for someone else, are things that kind of that traditional strong Black woman often does not do. So in retrospect, I can look back and see, of course, those patterns that were, not the healthiest. However, I did, when you're in it and the time I was in it and not yet a psychologist. So I couldn't recognize it in the same way that I do now, but I definitely see many of the common themes that I talk about in the book.
There was a line in one of your chapters. I mean, you write so eloquently and personably about this subject. And in one of the chapters, one line jumped out at me and it's still resonating with me. My strength has lied to me. And I thought, whoa, how does strength lie? When is it prone to lying? And what did that do to you? What does that mean?
Yeah. I think that we tell ourselves that we're strong, and in telling ourselves we're strong, we're discounting feelings that we believe are in contrast to that. So personally, it's discounting the fear, it's discounting the anxiety, it's discounting hurt and regret because I'm strong. I'm not those other things. I show up, I do things, I go to grad school, I hang out with my friends, I care for my family. And because I do those things, I can't be anxious and afraid and having difficulty in relationships. And that's simply not true. One of the things that I really want to challenge people to think, or invite rather, people to think about with this book is how we can be strong and all of these other things. That we don't have to one doesn't discount the other. We can be providers, caregivers, successful people, and be afraid and have struggle. And one doesn't diminish from the other, but we can hold space for all of it.
I'm so glad you said that, because there's so many times when I've heard people say, where I've even felt that if I'm not being strong in a situation, then the only other option is you're being weak. And that's not true. It's not one or the other. You can be vulnerable and strong. And so I appreciate you saying that. And I appreciated reading that in that chapter, because it's like, yes, just because you're not being strong right now doesn't mean you're not strong at all.
That's right.
But it's just not right now. It's not serving you well right now.
That's right. And I'm so glad that you raised the weak word, because that is what they're always positioned kind of in partnership. I'm not weak, I'm strong, right? And these other things mean weakness, and these other things are bad, and I absolutely can't be that. And so kind of challenging this idea of what does it mean to be strong? What does it mean to be weak? These labels that we kind of assign, and how we can, honor all the emotions, honor our humanity. Because we're not one thing all of the time. We're complex, multidimensional people that are allowed to experience the full range of emotions. And, this is also an invitation when those difficult emotions do come up, to notice them, and that noticing is the pathway to moving through them, where avoidance really keeps us stuck.
And a lot of people would admit to feeling a sense of not enoughness, but how is that feeling elevated in the lives of the Black women you've encountered?
Yeah, it shows up in so many ways. I think one of the primary ways it shows up is in the workplace. Many Black women have been told some version of the mantra, you have to be 2-3 times as good to get half as far. And there are real examples of, that goal line being moved, or being, denied opportunities that people have rightfully earned, having their achievements be discounted, being overlooked. And I think that's an experience that not only Black women can identify with, but women and other people of color certainly can identify with as well. Similarly in families, particularly when folks have been in families where there's some sort of verbal abuse, physical or sexual abuse, where messages of put downs, you're never going to be anything, you're unattractive, you're just like XYZ, bad caregiver. And these messages become ingrained in a person's thinking about themselves. And when they show up to my office, they believe these things to be true, right? Because they heard it for so long, and they're unable to separate this message from the harmful person that first planted that seed. And that's part of the work of therapy, is disentangling that and developing a more compassionate view of the self. But that's another way that not enoughness can show up. And then finally, in relationships, I talk about in the book how, our family of origin can plant the seed for intimate relationships that we engage in. And unfortunately, many people that have experienced trauma in their family of origin then go on to experience some sort of trauma or abuse in intimate relationships that kind of can reinforce this message of put downs, of not enoughness, of worthlessness. And so again, therapy can be a space where we're kind of untangling what some have unfortunately come to believe as truth. But we know it's not truth. It's stories that they've been told, and harmful messages that have become ingrained in their minds and their hearts.
You mentioned the stories that were told from family members or friends or folks, other relatives as we're growing up. How do you think that the news cycle or social media impacts the emotional lives of Black women?
Yeah, particularly in this past year, I think that the news cycle has been especially triggering. When we think about cumulative trauma or compounded trauma and those that have already had a traumatic experience in some point in their lifetime, and then they're positioned whereby they're frequently seeing police violence or frequently seeing the deaths of other Black people. That could be their sister, their brother, their parent, their spouse. That is triggering, and that's triggering in a very kind of emotionally and physically charged way. And so I think that's another real tangible example of how the last 18 months has had a unique impact on the Black community, who was already carrying a greater burden of stress and trauma.
We've had a audience question that seems to work well at this subject right here, this topic. How do we reframe what is commonly seen as the strong-weak dichotomy, which seems to be primary in the current binary culture? And the audience member is asking if you would describe how we can address it societally, not just individually.
Yeah, great. Thank you for asking that question. And I really invite people to hold space for it all and to consider removing the negative judgmental labels that they may attach to emotions. So thinking about depression as bad, anxiety as bad, various life experiences that have been challenging and difficult as bad things that have make them bad individuals, right? Rather than things that have happened, things that have been difficult, and removing those harmful labels, because these are messages, again, that become internalized. And to add on to that, one kind of specific thing that I work with people on in therapy is developing the practice of talking to themselves the way they might talk to a friend or a loved one. So would you call your loved one weak if they were having a bad day, or if they asked for help, or if they needed a break or a little extra care? Most of us wouldn't. We would engage with some compassion and with kindness. We're harder on ourselves so often. Often we're harder on ourselves than we are on those people that we care about. So bringing that same kindness and compassion to ourselves.
Wow. Did you see the light bulb go on above my head? I was just thinking, just over the weekend, I realized now I was having really nasty conversations with myself. I need to stop that. I would never talk to someone else like that. Why would we allow ourselves to talk to ourselves that way? That's wonderful. So thank you for that piece of wisdom. I'll be taking that with me into the next couple of weeks.
And so often we don't even realize it. That's the thing. It's so automatic and second nature. And so even just paying attention to how we talk to ourselves, I think is a really nice place to start.
There was a follow-up question that was related to that one. What could the library do to reframe the binary dichotomy framework?
That's a great question. I think that these types of conversations are really important in challenging folks' thought about how we see strength and weakness, how we understand emotional suffering, and how we care for ourselves and others. And so I think just continuing to create space for these types of conversations is playing a really important role.
Yes, the library, we pride ourselves on keeping this space safe to have these difficult conversations. I would also point out that if these conversations are too difficult for some folks to view or to participate in, the library's collections are a great place to start, to look for other books that could expose a reader to different viewpoints, to even outside your comfort zone. A book is a great way to go outside your comfort zone. You can do it privacy of your own home, and you can pick it up and put it down as you need to. And I know that everyone will find something in the KCPL collection that will challenge your current thoughts. There is something to offend everybody in a library collection. And if you can't find something to offend you in a library collection, then we're not doing our job. So that's what you want, a well-rounded collection. And that's a great place to start. We had, I'm jumping back earlier in our feed to a different question, and someone was responding to something you said earlier in our conversation, that there is a lack of professionals of color in all fields, even more in education that produces PhD education, and commercial practices pulling PhDs to industry rather than service. So this person's asking, how do we break the cycle that inhibits people entering into public service, especially those of color, when money has such strong appeal?
Yeah, I think we have to go out and grab them. This is the creating a pipeline of a diverse group of mental health providers, broadly speaking, is something that I dedicate a considerable amount of time to. So it's providing education and opportunity at the earliest stages, but also continuing along the career trajectory. So programming for high school students, undergraduate students, graduate students, PhD, master's level. And, even as a professor and a psychologist, that pull, as our friend in the audience mentioned, it can continue once people are in careers, because it can be a tough space for people of color who may feel isolated, may feel that burden of being the only, might be pulled to industry. I think I heard that as a part of the question. So not only pulling people into the careers, but making sure that they have the support and nurturing and opportunity to continue to excel and thrive and feel like it's a supportive space. But particularly as it pertains to mental health, I think that, quite frankly, a lot of other industries do a better job of kind of luring our young folks in. People in mental health, and I think I heard education mentioned in that list as well. It usually is kind of that heart seed is planted early on, or often someone has had like a pivotal life experience that draws them into it. People that are kind of mission focused in their work. But I think we can do a better job of going out and grabbing and cultivating talent, and the same way businesses and industry and what might be considered more lucrative, at least in the short term, more lucrative careers do a better, I think, quite frankly, a better job at doing.
It'd certainly be more emotionally fulfilling.
Well, yes, that too.
We had another audience remark, and some people will watch our conversation after it's concluded, and they'll think, well, that's a problem that, these issues that we're bringing up, these are problems that white women have, or that Black men have too. So how do we get to the point that we can talk about these things and acknowledge each other's pain without accidentally or maybe even intentionally marginalizing someone else's pain?
Yeah, I think there's space for it all, and we don't have to pit one group against the other. So focusing one conversation on Black women, in this case, doesn't in any way discount, dismiss, or minimize the suffering that other groups endure. What I would like, however, as kind of an extension of that comment is, it is true that other women and other individuals of other racial and ethnic groups have experienced much of what's talked about in the group and in the book, excuse me. And I hope that builds a mutual understanding and a mutual empathy for folks to be able to say, this is something that, even though we're talking about Black women here, I can understand and relate to that as well. Or if I'm not a Black woman, this helps me to understand or relate to someone in my personal life. And so in that way, we can just be more kinder, compassionate people and show up for each other more fully.
I saw that in one of the chapters of your book, that I think it was chapter 2, that long list of responses you got off social media. Because as I was reading your book, I was thinking, well, I can kind of relate to this. And then I saw that list and I thought, oh, I can only relate to a few things on this list. And it was mind-boggling, the list of stress. It was one whole page of stressors.
Yeah. So, I mean, speaking about that specifically, because some version of this question does come up quite a bit, everyone experiences stress. Many people experience trauma or relationship issues. But one thing I do, to your point, one thing I do highlight in the book is, indeed, that is true, but that it's the data show us there's a greater burden. And so both and, right? These are common shared experiences, but they're cumulative with Black women. And many things are kind of piling on top of each other. And in addition to that, there's this cultural context of the expectation of strength that really informs how we talk about that burden and how we care for or don't care for ourselves.
That leads us to the next audience question, which is to ask if you could talk a little bit more about the roots of the idea of the strong Black woman. The audience member suspects that there are a lot of people that don't quite understand how that ideal was forged. And in a lot of ways, it really was forged. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so, a lot of scholars point to the origin of the strong Black women to the period in which Black women were enslaved, and necessarily having to be strong as a survival mechanism, whereby showing weakness, showing vulnerable would mean real, tangible, life-threatening harm. And although that we're, no longer in those specific environmental circumstances, that those tenets of strength and those tenets of having to present ourselves in this tough, firm way to prevent from victimization, to prevent from being taken advantage of either by people in our families, on the street, at work, are still necessary. And those messages are passed down, I think, either, in many kind of passive ways in our families. It's modeled to us, like we talked about grandma and mom and I think about sisters in the Black church and, people that are showing up in community at volunteer events or various women's organizations. Many of them have these characteristics of strength, and little girls see that, our peers see that, and that sets the stage for how we are expected to continue to show up in the world. It's less common to talk about, the hurt, the pain. It's becoming more common now, which is a good thing, but that is new.
You conclude your book, and this may not be the last question for the evening, but it's a good one to end on if we need to. You conclude your book with a wonderful chapter on self-care, And it's so easy, and it's also dismissive to think of self-care as just wine and a bubble bath and some quality alone time. But that's not what you mean by self-care when you write about it. Can you talk a little bit about your philosophy of self-care?
Yeah. So in your lovely introduction, you pulled out that I was a mindfulness trainer, and that is a big part of what I really think about in terms of self-care. When I'm talking about mindfulness, is really starting with the act of paying attention to what's showing up. And so often we, particularly Black women, are so busy doing so much. Our minds are full of so much. We're running from one thing to the other that we're just not paying attention to how we feel. And there's a lot there. And that, going back to the pandemic, that was hard for a lot of people to be forced to slow down, and all this stuff starts showing up. So my number one place of self-care is slowing down enough to pay attention, to being able to ask yourself, how am I feeling in this moment? What do I need in this moment? What behaviors can I take to care for myself? That might mean telling someone no. That might mean expressing a feeling to someone. It might mean doing something joyous for yourself. We don't want to forget about joy. That might be the bubble bath, if you will. But this idea of slowing down, paying attention, and prioritizing the self, because so often we're self-sacrificing. That's another kind of key piece of the strong Black women, sacrificing our individual needs for others. So reprioritizing the self and taking those critical steps in order to care for our mental health and our physical health.
We're going to switch now, if you have a moment, to an education situation. We have a public school teacher in a Title IX school, and the teacher writes that we are overemphasizing socio-emotional learning due to the pandemic, but the teacher wonders if they're meeting the needs of all students. So can you speak to that?
Meeting the needs of all students in terms of the focus on social emotional health. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that it's important to attend to it for all students, certainly, and understanding that particular groups of students might have greater levels of need when it comes to their emotional health than others, and how the school system in particular can be available to both identify those unique needs and provide that extra level of support. One thing that, I think there's been some conversation around in the context of the pandemic and what isolation has meant, especially for kids, is that there are many kids where the home environment is not a safe, pleasant environment. And the school is their opportunity for getaway, for safety, for nurturing, for exposure. And so identifying what that might mean for those kids that are in a less than ideal home environment, and how their emotional needs are being attended to in that space.
It's really tough on students. The last years we've seen, I'm hearing from the students in my life how difficult it's been, and yet they seem so resilient.
Yes.
And able to roll with it. But I'm also wondering, what should I be looking for to make sure that I'm hearing them and helping them?
Yeah, I think it's the same as what we're seeing in adults. The withdrawal, I think, are signs to look for. The anger and irritability, deep sadness, lack of interest as opportunities do present themselves when young folks are still not re-engaging in ways that are now available to them. Those can be some signs that there may be having a bit of difficulty adjusting.
Inger, when we see those signs in our friends and family members, in students, in coworkers, what would you suggest would be good courses of action to help bring those people back or help connect with them in some way? What are some good starting steps?
Sure. I start with simply, again, paying attention to our loved ones. If there's a theme for the book and for our conversation, it's, too often we're walking past each other, existing next to each other without really paying attention. So paying attention, asking how folks are doing and listening for the answer, holding space to the degree that you have the emotional capacity to do so for whatever they might be dealing with at that particular time. Doing so with an empathetic, non-judgmental ear. That's an ear that's not dismissing how someone's feeling, not giving blanket statements like, oh, it's not that bad, everything's going to be okay, but just validating those experiences. And particularly if it's, a non-crisis situation, if it's a coworker or a friend, simply asking, how can I support you? Would you like me to call you regularly? Shall we schedule regular meetups? What do you need from me that would be supportive and helpful to you at this particular time? And then you can assess if that's something you can give, or maybe you can give a modified version of that.
That is a wonderful piece of instruction. That one makes so much sense. That's so warm and open. So thank you. I'm walking away with so many marvelous things from this conversation and from your book. This has just been a delight. So Inger, let's close. I want to ask you what your favorite form of self-care is, and if it's reading or what brings you joy.
Yeah, I allude to this in the book, but my favorite form of self-care is yoga. I came to yoga in college. I had dreams of being a professional ballet dancer when I was in college, and ballet introduced me to yoga. And so I started a yoga practice in college and have been practicing pretty consistently for about the past 15 years. And as you mentioned earlier, became a certified yoga instructor. And, yoga has been so important in terms of managing my own anxiety, my own stress, managing my physiological response to stress, that shortness of the breath, that tightness and tension in the neck and the back. I mean, my stress definitely shows up in my body in a real obvious way. And yoga has been really life-changing in terms of having something that I can practice in community and on my own for as little or as much time as is available to me. So that's my go-to.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. It's my go-to as well. That
awesome.
have done so much aside from just general flexibility and not turning into a creaky old lady. It also means I'm not turning into a cranky old lady.
It helped physically and emotionally, that mind-body connection. Absolutely.
Yes. I don't think I know anyone who doesn't feel physically the stress when it's in their body. That's where our stress likes to live.
It does. And it creeps up on us in that way.
Well, thank you so much, Inger. This has been delightful, and we've had some wonderful questions from the audience. We really appreciate all the great questions you've put in the chat tonight, folks. Please go to bookshop.org and get a copy of Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. You can see it over Inger's shoulder there, right there. And yes, thank you. It's got a gorgeous cover, and it is so approachable and accessible and compelling. This is a book that you will flip through and you might not even realize how much you're learning as you're reading this. So does not have an academic tone at all. It's so conversational. It feels as if you are speaking this to us. So thank you so much, Inger, for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate it. Best of luck on the rest of your book tour. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Good night, and hope to see you in the library.
Thank you. It's been my absolute pleasure.